Good afternoon and welcome to Diversity MBA's Smart Leadership Webinar Series. The voice you're hearing is Larissa Williams. I'm the Vice President for the Center of Excellence for Diversity MBA. We are so very excited that you've joined us today. And I want to first start by acknowledging it's Women's History Month. Woohoo! We're so excited. And if this is your first time, welcome again. And you are in for a special treat today. We are indeed so very happy that you've taken the time out of your day to join our monthly webinar series for supporting your professional growth and development. Today, we are here to learn about and celebrate Women's History Month by learning the lessons that have prevailed throughout history. But before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are recording today's session, and the recording will be shared with our member company partners immediately following the session. Today's session will be highly interactive and engaging with the opportunity for you to ask questions. Should you have any questions for our speaker, please enter the questions or your question in the chat and it will be addressed accordingly. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Gloria Feldt, co-founder and president of Take the Lead. Take the Lead is a nonprofit organization with the goal of seeing women reach leadership parity across all sectors by 2025. I'm really excited about that. So Gloria, I'm waiting for that day. She has spent the last 6 decades advocating for women's rights. She was the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, which is the world's largest reproductive health advocacy organization. And she is a best-selling author with 4 published books on gender and power, and a past speaker at our very own Publishing Summit, and a guest on our weekly radio show. And this is big, and a recent recipient of the Forbes 50 Over 50 Impact. I guess it wasn't an award, Gloria, but it was a recognition. So
a recognition, yes, thank you.
You were recognized with some powerful women. So again, it is my pleasure to introduce Gloria Feldt. Gloria, take it over.
Thank you so much, Larissa, and thank you all for being here today and for honoring me with the opportunity to be here with you on this most auspicious second day of Women's History Month and just after Black History Month. And yes, we're going to talk about a lot of the lessons from history with a particular focus on how they can help you as a leader. But first, I want to thank you. I just want to thank you for your incredibly important work. We are at a historic moment, and I sure don't need to tell you that, where it is more important than ever for you to be leading in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I'd really appreciate it if you would share with me, those of you who are here would share with me one woman in history, past or present, who has inspired you to do the work that you do. If you just put that in the chat, I would love to get some sense of who are those women, past or present, who have really inspired you to do the work that you're doing. It's not always easy work, and it's always challenging. And so whoever's brave enough to put in the first comment might actually win a prize. We'll see. I don't know. There's some valuable prizes here if somebody's willing to share, because I'd love to know who has inspired you to do the work that you do. I'm looking at my chat and I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to go on to the next question that I have for you, because I'd love to know from your voice, with your voice, what are the top challenges that you are facing today? I have a suspicion that there are a lot of them today. There has been a great trend toward companies having diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, but we're in a very difficult space today sometime. And I have to say that although it's no laughing matter, I'm reminded of an old joke that is supposedly the most beloved and funniest in the world. If you've heard it already, just humor me. But it's about perceptions and reality. So Sherlock Holmes and his sidekick, Dr. Watson, decide to go on a camping trip. And after dinner and a bottle of wine, they settle down in their tent and go to sleep. Some hours later, Watson awakes and he nudges his faithful friend, Sherlock Holmes, and he says, "Holmes, look up at the sky and tell me, what do you see?" "Well," Holmes replied, "I see millions of stars." "What does that tell you?" Sherlock says, "Well, astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce that the time is approximately 3:15 a.m. Theologically, I can see that God is all powerful and that we are small and insignificant. Meteorologically, I suspect that we will have a beautiful day tomorrow." "What does it tell you, Watson?" Sherlock Holmes asked. Watson was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "Holmes, you idiot, somebody stole our tent." Well, you as DEI professionals might feel like somebody has stolen your tent these days, and you don't have to be Dr. Watson to figure out what's going on. You might be reeling from the attacks on the whole concept of valuing diversity and inclusion. Some of it is just blatant racism rooted in fear of losing power and privilege. And some of it has been called diversity exhaustion because not all of the problems have been solved. Top management gets a little, kind of cynical about it or just moves on to the next topic of the day. And no doubt, as companies start to tighten their belts, DEI is last hired and first fired, just as women's initiatives have gone by the wayside in many companies over the last few years. I see that there are responses in the, okay, so can you share those responses with me because I cannot see them. Oh, Diana says, "My mother and my mentor inspired me." Great. Are there other responses? Thank you, Diana. I appreciate that. The chat is not. I don't know what the.
My mother inspired me.
Fabulous. It's so interesting to me how often people will say that their mothers or their grandmothers or their aunts inspired them, and that kind of reinforces my thinking about how we all are history makers. We are all history makers. So thank you very much for that, and feel free to keep putting things in the chat because we can keep talking about them as we go. Happy to do that. So there's a reason why Know Your History and You Can Create the Future of Your Choice is the first of my 9 leadership power tools on which I built the whole Take the Lead unique leadership development program. And since it's Women's History Month, the long view of women's history with an intersectional lens might help us show the way to recapturing our tent. And it will provide examples of how we can today learn from history so that we can create the future of our choice. Key takeaways will focus on the vision to see, the courage to take action, the critical importance of partnerships, and an understanding that we are all making history every single day. So I want to break those down, and I'm going to break them down a little bit just sort of as topics, and then I want to give some examples, and I'm going to do that through the lens of the women's suffrage movement, which is often one of the topics that people talk about a lot during Women's History Month. And as it turns out, it's much more complicated than we usually talk about it. And I think that's important for us to know all of that. So the five key takeaways are that the 5 key takeaways to help, I think, leaders in today's volatile world are, first of all, vision. You have to start with the vision to see injustice and to be able to envision a more just and equitable world. Because very often we take for granted what's around us and think that's the way things are. but not necessarily. A real leader has a vision for how to make things better, more, kinder, whatever your adjectives might be. Then you have to have the courage to break the boundaries, to wear the shirt, as I call it, wear the shirt of your convictions, and stay true to your values, even when it's tough to do so. And thirdly, you have to take action, because power unused is power useless, and vision without action is nothing but a pipe dream. So that formula there is what I call VCA. And that's going to be the heart and soul of a new mastermind that I am going to, a mastermind series that I'm starting later this month, March 23rd to be exact. And it's from my latest book, which is called Intentioning: Sex, Power, Pandemics, and How Women Will Take the Lead for Everyone's Good. And this formulation of vision, courage, action, and sometimes action has to come before courage. Action sometimes gives you the courage. VCA, the VCA method of intention, is a core part of that mastermind conversation and a core part of what I teach in the book Intentioning. So I just wanted to share that with you, but at the same time, I think it's really important to add these two additional points to round out the lessons of women's history. The first one is partnerships. You got to know who your real allies are. We are stronger together. Don't let racism, sexism, or fear of controversy lead to expediency over integrity. So important. And believe me, we're going to come to some examples of when that perspective on partnership has not been made and it has not served the women's movement that well. And then finally, maintain knowledge of history to learn its lessons and lead to understanding that change is possible, but it's not inevitable. That's the thing. Things don't just happen, people make them happen. And it's never over when you think it's over. We all make tomorrow's history every single day. So vision, courage, action, partnerships, and knowledge of history. Let's unpack those 5 lessons from women's history further through the lens of the 80-year struggle for women's suffrage. And I'm going to take my glasses off because I put them on to read the chat, and I don't need them right now. So much better. Okay. All right. So let's talk about vision. It always starts with a vision. It always starts with vision. You know, when early American abolitionists Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were at an anti-slavery meeting in 1840, what did they have a vision of that nobody had before? Oh, they realized that women's rights were not part of the equation that was being discussed, but they felt strongly that women's rights should be part of it. And so the beginning of the women's rights movement is typically gauged from that point. Now, I just want to interject a personal story about that because, excuse me just a moment. To interject a personal story that's somewhat similar, I got involved in social justice movement through the civil rights movement of the 1960s. You've already calculated my age, so I'm just going to use it bear it proudly. Yeah, I often say I think I'm the most over 50 of all the Forbes 50 over 50s, but that's fine. That's good. I'm very lucky that I am able to continue making my life's passions into my life's work. And my passion for social justice started in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And even though I was living in Odessa, Texas, where nobody believes there were actually people who were engaged and involved, but yes, there were a few of us. So I did notice fairly quickly that the women were doing most of the work and the men were getting all the credit and getting all the leadership positions. So for me, I had sort of an epiphany at that moment, a new vision that, wait a minute, if there are civil rights, then women must have them too. And that is what has propelled me personally on my path toward gender equality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton rather boldly suggested at the time in 1840 that women should have the right to vote. And Lucretia Mott she just couldn't see that part of the vision. She thought it would make them a laughing stock if they said such a thing. She just said, Lizzie, they will just make a laughing stock of us, because nobody had yet had the vision of women's right to vote. So first you have to actually see the injustice, and then you have to have a vision of the different world that you can create. Okay, so that's number one. That's about vision. Secondly is courage. You must have the courage to break boundaries of the known and go into new spaces. You have to be the change, even though when people in power think the status quo is sacred and something that was always meant to be that way. You know, President Grover Cleveland said in somewhere around 1890 or so, he said, sensible and responsible women do not want to vote. The relative positions, and listen to this part of it, the relative positions to be assumed by man and woman in the working out of our civilization were assigned long ago by a higher intelligence than ours. And generally speaking, you know, the attribution to God or some other cosmic entity that, well, it's the way it is because that's the way it's supposed to be, that's often a default argument that we hear, and you probably hear some of that today too. Well, by this time, the late 1800s, the suffrage movement was gaining steam, and national organizations had formed, and rifts had already formed between the movements for racial and gender equality. In 1851, the enslaved woman formerly enslaved woman known as Sojourner Truth, which is the name she gave herself, began a lecture tour that included a women's rights conference in Akron, Ohio, where she delivered her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And in that speech, she challenged prevailing notions of both racial and gender inferiority. And she reminded people that look at her. Look at her strength, her physical strength. Look at her ability to speak and to talk, and that she was able to do anything that any man could do. However, she was a woman. Now, Truth ultimately split with Frederick Douglass, who was one of the few males who were supportive of women's rights, and who was both an abolitionist and a women's rights advocate. But ultimately, he believed that formerly enslaved men should come before women's suffrage. He thought that suffrage for the formerly enslaved men should come first. And he argued, and Sojourner Truth made a powerful argument that both should occur simultaneously. However, she did not win that battle, but she said something that has honestly guided my own movement building work for decades. She said, if women want more rights than they've got, why don't they just take them? Well, I don't have Truth's eloquence, but I'm going to tell you that I believe women do not need to be empowered. We have power, but we often don't realize how much power we have. And we often don't value it in ourselves, which leads me to the third part of the VCA method of intentioning, which is action. You know, the humorist Will Rogers said, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. For 80 years, women kept taking action, often against brutal odds. I want to give you an example of that action. To bring attention to the battle for suffrage, there was a woman named Rosalie Jones in upstate New York. She organized groups of women to march long distances in 1912. She called these marches pilgrimages, and the women marching were pilgrims. In December of that year, 1912, over 200 women joined Rosalie for parts of a march that was over 140 miles from New York City to Albany, New York, the state capital. Now, only a handful of women, including Rosalie, completed the entire route, and because the march took 13 cold, wintry, snowy, muddy, mucky days. During the march, The women would stop, though, to hold open air meetings, and they got more people to get engaged and involved with their cause. They gave out pamphlets in communities along the way, and symbolically, they carried yellow knapsacks and votes for women banners. Now, Rosalie's mother was opposed to women's suffrage. So I want to bring that point out, because just as we have some women today who are not in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, there were women then who opposed women's right to vote. So her own mother said that the march was ridiculous, but that did not stop her. It was during this pilgrimage, carrying petitions to the governor, that Rosalie earned the nickname General Jones, because she wasn't going to let anything stop her. Well, in the next few years leading up to ratification of the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, there were quite a few instances of women being beaten and jailed as they would demonstrate or as they pressed for the simple right to vote. But their courageous actions called attention to their cause. And as they called attention to their cause, it caused people to think about it and talk about it. And more public sympathy was aroused and support for the 19th Amendment. You know, I just have to take a detour here of what I don't have in my speech, but I'm going to tell you, if you don't know already, how the suffrage amendment finally was passed after all those years. It was in the state of Tennessee, and the state legislature had to vote on it, and they were evenly split. A young man who was in his first legislative, what's the word I'm looking for? He had just been elected for the first time, and he was planning to vote against the suffrage amendment because his peers were. And he, you know, again, all he saw was that's how things had always been. Women had not had the right to vote. Well, he received a letter from his mother, who asked him to please be a good boy and vote for women's suffrage. And he did. That one vote in that one state legislature is what put the 19th Amendment over the top, and ultimately was able to get it enshrined in the United States Constitution. So every one of us can be a history maker in whatever way and from whatever seat we find ourselves in. If mom hadn't told her son to be a good boy and cast his vote for women's suffrage, we might still be fighting that battle. So there you have VCA, Vision, Courage, Action, the 3 powers of intention, that you will explore further if you read my book, Intentioning, or if you join my mastermind starting March 23rd. But there are 2 other strategic leadership lessons that I wanted to talk with you about today. One of them is partnerships, and you probably know the old adage, we have to hang together or we will surely hang separately. Well, while initially the women's movement emerged, as I've mentioned, out of the abolitionist movement, and at first the 2 movements were aligned, pretty soon there were rifts that mirrored the biases in our society then and now. And some of those rifts were about strategy, literally about strategy, but there were also about the biases that were in society then, many of which we still see now. By the late 1800s, white women had essentially pushed Black women out of prominence. And though Black women, to their credit, continued to march, continued to work for suffrage, but literally many of them who did amazing work were erased from the history books and are just now being retrieved. There are some, like Sojourner Truth, who I mentioned, and Ida B. Wells, who were quite well known as suffrage leaders as well as civil rights leaders. But the terrible truth is that to get the votes out of the all-white men in power, the white women took the position that women would just vote like their husbands. So they really kind of gave up their reason for being. They believed that it would be too controversial to have the multiple races involved, and they believed that they had to persuade the men, because after all, there were no women in state legislatures who could cast votes, they figured they had to persuade them by telling them that women would just vote like their husbands. And in doing that, they relinquished most of the progressive agenda that they had at the turn of the 20th century, when childcare, healthcare, better working conditions, those were as much on the political table then as they are now. We're still talking about the same things and trying to get them enacted into our policies. So you know, it really was a setback that they made their agenda so small and that they failed to keep the partnerships going, so that the coalitions were smaller, and it did not serve well. We can look at history as the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, you know, as we were looking at it as that 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment approached in 2020. But that revealed that although women's suffrage movement had led to the ratification of that amendment, excuse me, one of the joys of working from home, right? So let me start that over again. Although the ratification of the 19th Amendment happened in 1920, it did not guarantee all women the right to vote, as the history books often suggest. Now, the amendment does say exactly this, that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. However, many women of color still found themselves navigating Jim Crow laws prohibiting or suppressing their vote. Indigenous women and Asian Americans had to wait years to get their full voting rights. And as the election cycles of 2020 and 2022 proved, women and many men of color still had to work for full access to the polls and to overcome widespread efforts to suppress the vote in many states. By separating the movements instead of massing their strengths, we are still bearing the negative results of that. We're still struggling to ensure voting rights for all Americans. I'm going to say, I may have already said this. If I did, pardon me, but I say it all the time, that racism and sexism are joined at the head, along with anti-gay prejudice, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, and other biases that are implicit and explicit, and that we are still battling today, and that are the reasons why your work is so important. Your work is just so important. The leadership lesson is to understand those root causes of the drive to end DEI programs, to eliminate teaching about race at all, let alone about the history of Blacks, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian people. Partnerships in rooting out these deep-seated biases are essential. None of us can do it alone. And so we come to the overarching message that I want to leave you with today. And it goes back to my leadership power tool number 1. Know your history, and you can create the future of your choice. Each of us in our actions, and especially in our leadership roles, is creating tomorrow's history today. Now, one more story to tell you about that. Alice Paul, one of the suffragist leaders, she in 1923, she was one of the few of those suffragist leaders who understood that you must always be pressing forward with a proactive agenda, or else you will be pushed back. So what did she do? She decided that she would start making some history. She wrote the Equal Rights Amendment that year, 1923. 100 years ago, most of her colleagues thought that getting the right to vote was the end of the struggle, but Alice Paul knew it was just the beginning. Now, perhaps you noticed the news this past week that a Senate hearing was held to attempt to get the ERA finally written into the Constitution, because it's been passed by the requisite number of states. But the archivist has not published it in the Constitution. And neither has President Biden instructed the archivist to do that. So we are still fighting that battle, even though the ERA has like 90% public approval, and a similar number of people actually believe it already is in the Constitution, but it's not. So women are still not acknowledged at all in the United States Constitution. I'm curious to know if you all knew that. So here's the deal. Power and energy come from moving into new spaces, not from standing still, not from resting on your laurels. So there is so much work yet for us to do. But with vision, courage, action, partnerships, knowledge of history, you can not just get your tent back, but you will be the leaders to create the future of your choice, a much more beautiful future, a future that turns your vision of a more just and equitable world into tomorrow's reality. Your courage to take action and your willingness to make partnerships will make history. And in the future years, as a result of that, we may look toward little girls and boys today reading about the history you have made when they grow up. Are you ready? That's my question to you. And now I would like to take your questions to me and see what you're thinking about and whether these 5 ways, 5 takeaways of vision, courage, action, partnerships, and knowing your history can help you in your leadership in our mutual goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion for all. Thank you. Larissa, can we take some questions?
We sure can. If you have any questions for Gloria, you can enter them in the questions section, or you can maybe unmute your microphone and ask the questions live.
Yes, I would be very happy for you to unmute and just ask the questions if you're willing to do that. Is there an argument? Can you help me really know more about what you're thinking about and what you're worrying about these days? Because I'd really appreciate that.
I would really love to hear more about courage, courage, excuse me, how you said that we need to stay true to our values. And sometimes that can be quite difficult when you are the minority in the room, when they're, if you're in the C-suite and they're just mostly men and you're the only woman. So can you give us some examples of how we can live into that courage when we are of the minority?
Oh gosh, that is a great question, Larissa. Thank you so much for asking it, because I'm sure it's something that all women and all people of color and everybody who's been marginalized in any way has had that kind of a question. Now, it's certainly true that you have to pick your battles. I'm going to be realistic about that. I'm not going to tell people to just go in and be, pugilistic from the very beginning, but here's my thought. And I'm going to tell you, you may have heard me mention the phrase "wear the shirt." I'm going to tell you where that comes from. Mm-hmm. So when I was the CEO of Planned Parenthood in Arizona, we had a clinic in a very small, rural, very conservative town, and outside of Phoenix. And I was there visiting with the staff one day, and they said to me, every day before we go home, we have to decide if we're going to wear our shirts that have the Planned Parenthood logo on them that we wear in the clinic, or whether we take them off because and put on our regular street clothes, because do we really want to have to talk about what we do if we want to stop and get gas or get groceries or whatever we're doing? And I thought for a minute, and I said, that is probably the most important time for you to wear the shirt. And I think we're just all called to wear the shirt of our convictions and to practice that practice that courage. And the more we do it, the more we grow the courage muscles. So here are a few tips for it. Number one, have a meeting before the meeting. Have a meeting before the meeting. Make sure that you have some allies before you go in, some partners who will speak up and support you if you feel you need to call out some kind of bias that you see. That's number one. Also, you can, I think during the Obama administration, the women in his cabinet noticed that the men were getting all the attention in the meetings, and they created something they called amplification. And they would have a meeting before the meeting in which they would discuss what issues and topics they were each going to bring up so that they could support each other verbally during the course of the meeting. And they were all prepared before they went in. So in an organizational setting, you know, the idea is not to create conflict, but to also understand that conflict and controversy can be your best friend, because those are moments when people they're teachable moments. They're moments when it's important for you to be able to stay calm, get your breathing centered, and you might have the opportunity to share why you believe the way you believe, why you're proposing what you're proposing, when perhaps it's not being addressed or addressed positively by other people. So it's difficult, I know, but I always felt like it was such worthy. It's so worthy to do that. And you know, when you challenge a prevailing culture, you know, when you're showing yourself as being willing to engage in conversations, even when they're challenging, you know that you're paving the way for that next person. And to me, that is a big, reward. So
Yeah,
just knowing that you're doing the important work.
right,
Is
right. Thank
your
you for
mindset.
that. Because I've heard that many times. Have the meeting before the meeting. Yes, it can be very strategic, as Diana Stark said in the chat. What's one way of effectively identifying your allies? Because that could be challenging. You could think that someone is your ally, but they're really not. So, how can you effectively identify who your true allies are?
Oh gosh. So I just you make me think about one of the chapters and bits of advice in the intentioning book is about the importance of leading like a woman. And you probably know the data that companies with more women in their upper leadership are more profitable.
Yes.
You probably know the data that you add a woman to a group that's been all male and it raises the group intelligence. Well, in neither of those instances is it hardwired. It's not that women are better than men. It's that because we have been in the minority in those rooms, we have had, as a survival mechanism, we've had to learn to read the room. We've had to learn to have more empathy. We've had to, so as it turns out, those elements of our socialization have become our superpowers. And in answer to your question about figuring out who is your ally and who isn't, personally, I know it's been hard during the pandemic, but I'm a great believer in lunch.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a great believer in breaking bread. And one of the exercises that I do in the training is called your power map. But you don't need a form to do it with. You can do it with pencil and paper. And you put that person who has the most impact on your future in the middle in a circle. And then you figure out where you are in relationship to that person. And then you plot other people who have that person's ear. And you figure out, okay, who do I need to nurture? Who do I need to have that lunch with? Who have I not called up in a while and said, hey, how are you doing? It's all about relationships. The world turns on human connections. So nurturing those human connections can take a lot of energy, but the payoff is immense. And that's how you'll find out who your real allies are. And sometimes you will get burned.
Hmm.
Sometimes you will get burned.
Yeah, we've all been there.
But wouldn't you rather be the person who doesn't burn somebody? So
You're exactly right.
yeah,
You're
so
right.
don't let it get you down.
That's good. That's good. So, any more questions from our attendees for Gloria? Because, I can ask many, many questions, but I really want to use this as an opportunity for you to ask any questions should you have any.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Yes, I really enjoyed your presentation, Gloria. Question for you. It was on a roundtable discussion, and someone said that they were over mentored and under sponsored.
Yes.
I know that's probably a common cliche. I'd never heard it before, but I mean, it's definitely I can feel it. I can relate to it. So what does that mean to you, and how do you win over sponsors?
Well, I can highly recommend, if you don't know who Carla Harris is, look her up and get her latest book, Lead to Win. And or just watch some of her speeches. She made the most incredible speech at Take the Lead's launch event in 2014. I watch that speech about 4 or 5 times a year just to remember what a great speech with great advice really is. And what she says, the way she puts it is, you need to think about who will carry your paper when you're not in the room. Those are your sponsors. Those are, a mentor will give you some advice, but a sponsor will actually promote you, will actually speak on your behalf. If something comes up in the room, perhaps they're talking about, what talent exists in the organization that might be right to promote to a certain new position. That's what you want. You want to have nurtured people who know enough about you. How do you make that happen? I'm going to go back to having lunch. I'm going to go back to making sure that you have nurtured relationships, that you have, and you have to give as well as get. To give as well as get. But I have a story that I tell often about someone who sponsored me when I didn't even know it, and I try to do this for the next person. And her name was Mildred. She was my first boss. She had started the Head Start when the whole program was brand new, and my first job was teaching at Head Start. And she would often ask me to take on tasks that I would not have raised my hand and said I want to do. And sometimes it would annoy me. But I realized in the end that what she was doing was she was really helping to develop me. That's a sponsor also. That's a sponsor also. Now, the other part of the Mildred story is that was my first and only job. And when Mildred was literally on her deathbed, unbeknownst to me, she wrote a letter of recommendation, handed it to me when I went to visit her in the hospital. And that was the only recommendation I had when I was being interviewed for my first CEO job. So you never know when what you do will set the next person's life. So you're going to give it and you're going to get it. Ask for what you want. Ask for what you want. Identify the people who you think really have the confidence that they garner the confidence within the organization. Don't hesitate to ask someone to be your sponsor, and be sure that you're sponsoring the next person on down the line. It's a virtuous circle. And do check out Carla Harris's book. She's just like amazing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And what else I've learned also, Gloria, that's a great question. So thank you so much for asking that question. I've also learned that it's always good to have more than one sponsor, because if you have a sponsor, and that when that sponsor leaves it kind of, kind of leaves you out there to dry, sort of say, like who's your champion, who's speaking about you in those closed doors where decisions are being made. So I really love when you say have that, break bread with people and try to nurture those relationships so that you can have more, potentially more than just one sponsor.
Yeah,
'Cause you
Larissa,
never-
there's something else I want to add to that too, which is don't expect people to know the value that you are bringing to the organization.
Mhm.
Don't expect people to know that. You have to often tell them that. And if you want, if there is something that you want, you have to tell them that also. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but how does somebody know that you are really interested in being the chief diversity officer or the CEO of an organization if you don't say so? And don't expect that they're going to tap you on the shoulder and say, oh, you've done such good work. We're going to put you in this role. You have to tell people what you want, and you need that. And your sponsors and any of your supervisors need to always know what you have done, what you have accomplished. So don't hide your light under the bushel basket, as they say. You have to tell people what you want.
Mhm.
Nobody's clairvoyant.
Yep, that's right. You got to manage your career, right?
That's right. That's right. I said to somebody the other day, you're the CEO of your own life, no matter what.
That is
And
true.
and it really is true. It really is true. Yeah. And people
So
who
good.
people who think like that, and realize that they have power from whatever seat they're sitting in are typically the people who do get promoted.
But do you believe that women need to be coached on how to go about doing that? How to really talk about yourself? Because you find that men do that easier than women. Um, so, in your experience, have you found yourself coaching women on how to really put themselves out there and how to talk about themselves and ask for what they want?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh
Mhm.
yes. Quite a lot.
That doesn't come
And
naturally for many of us.
it starts with for the unique curriculum that we have at Take the Lead. It's not like any other women's leadership program. It really is different because we know that you can get the nuts and bolts of leadership anywhere. But what you don't get is an understanding of power and really deconstructing power. And what I found in my research for my books is that women often have an ambivalent relationship with power because we have borne the brunt of so many negative aspects of it. And so very often women will not own the power they have because they have this is not a good thing in their minds. And also there's a two-edged sword. Very often if women appear to be powerful, they are not liked. And if they don't appear to be powerful, it's assumed they can't do the job. So there's a two-edged sword. You have to learn how to walk on the edge of it, but you can learn it. It's a learnable, teachable skill. But first you have to understand power. First, you need to reframe power in your own mind to understand that there's a difference between the oppressive power over that has been the narrative of history and the generative, creative idea of power as the power to make life better for yourself, your family, your organization, the world. And once women can think like that, I would just see, literally their faces change. It's like they relax. And they're like, well, I want that kind of power. And when you go from that kind, understanding that you want that kind of power, then you can proceed to analyzing the power that you already have and the value that you bring. And once you do that, you are free to elevate your intentions for leadership. So it's a multi-step process, but it's a very gratifying one. And I just see it happen for women all the time. You can't make people confident. You can't make people confident. But what you can do is you can help people to understand the value that they bring and know how to articulate it in a positive way.
That's the word confidence, right? Building that confidence and knowing that you deserve to be at that table, that you worked hard to get at that table. So, because when you look at there was research that was done, I think it's done all the time in academia, but more women go to pursue like a graduate level degree, go to college and university versus men. There's a
Mhm.
higher percentage of women who pursue that higher education. And
Mhm.
so, not to say that education is everything, experience also accounts for a lot too. So I love that confidence. Yes, that's so important.
Well, and I will say this about confidence, which is don't wait until you feel 100% confident.
Go in shaking, right?
Yeah, you're never going to get there. And it's actually good to have a little lack of confidence, because if you were totally confident all the time, you might stop learning. And you want to you want to have enough humility that you know you don't know everything.
That's
But
good.
so
That's
what? So what? You can still just try it and do it. I mean,
good.
very often people do their best work when they first start a new job. Why? Because they don't know what they're doing. And they have to be open and they have to learn. So don't wait until you're 100% confident. Once you get to that, 75, 80%, you're good.
I love it. I love it. Wonderful coaching.
This is what I love, as you can tell.
Yeah. So we have a few more minutes. Any more questions for Gloria before we wrap up?
While we're waiting, if you want to speak up, just speak up. Don't
Yes, you can
hesitate. Yeah,
unmute
but
and ask.
meanwhile, I'm just going to mention to people that I have provided the Diversity MBA folks with a chapter from Intentioning, which is called Creating a Culture of Inclusion. And when I wrote the book, it started out as a kind of a small women's leadership book with a few chapters of the 9 leadership intentioning tools and women's stories, which I love to tell. But I started writing it before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic started, I realized that I needed to, number one, include chapters on dealing with the mass disruptions, which we will always have, by the way. And also chapters on diversity and inclusion, because of the blatant racism in our society that had always been there, but finally people were seeing it after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others, sad to say. So, one of the chapters is called Creating a Culture of Inclusion. It probably doesn't have anything that you all don't already know, but I just wanted to share it with you as an example of how we approach diversity and inclusion at Take the Lead. And it's not that different from our women's leadership programs, because I still think you have to understand power first and foremost. You have to understand power and be willing to assess what you have and embrace it. But I wanted to share that with you so that you would have it as just an example of how we approach the areas that you're working in. And we're always learning, always wanting to hear from you. The PDF that you will receive also has all the contact information for me, for Take the Lead, a little bit about our programs and services, but mostly it's about the book. So it's not so much about what Take the Lead can do, but it does tell you how to reach us. It has a link also to the new Intentioning Mastermind, and it has my direct information. So anytime you want to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to hear from you.
Okay, so we don't have any other questions. Gloria, any final thoughts before we go? We have a couple of more minutes.
My final thoughts are, again, to just say thank you for your work. Just thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And if the going gets a little tough right now, just know you're in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for attending this month's Diversity Smart webinar series. We are so excited that you took a few minutes out of your day to come and join us in this provocative conversation with Miss Gloria Feldt. So, Gloria, thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.